The first doctor to reach the wounded president was Charles Leal. He was a 23-year-old assistant surgeon in the Union Army. He did his best to stabilize the president, but he said afterwards he knew that the wounds were mortal. He decided very quickly that they wanted to remove the president from the crowds and the panic in the theater. And so a group of men took the president's limp body outside of the theater, and a man from across the street waved them over into what was a boarding house, the Peterson boarding house. And here the Union officials began to commandeer the first floor of that boarding house. And the men removed the president to the back room where he was laid across diagonally a small bed. The president was 6'4" tall. They propped him up and did their best to make him comfortable, and soon the boarding house was beginning to fill with people. Of course, there was Mary Lincoln and Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris, Henry Rathbone still bleeding from his wounds. And now there were also Union military officials, including the Secretary of War, who almost immediately began to organize a manhunt for an investigation of the alleged conspirators, for the murderer, the soon-to-be murderer, John Wilkes Booth. There were also political figures who came here. And of course, there were crowds gathering outside. And as people were coming and going, you can imagine the anxiety that was welling up among these crowds, including a number of black residents of Washington, D.C. It was a mixed-race crowd out in that street, and it was a tense moment in the city's history. The doctors who came, including the Lincoln family physician, they said they knew from the beginning the president's wounds were mortal, but they did their best to relieve the pressure in his head and to try to make him as comfortable as possible. But he finally died at 7:22 in the morning, Saturday, April 15th. And it was Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who stood next to the dead president's body and said famously, "Now he belongs to the ages." It was a terrible and historic moment, seared into the nation's consciousness, because in this highly religious, deeply patriotic culture, this was a president who was shot on Good Friday, who died on Easter weekend at the very end of a gripping and terrible war. And almost immediately, the printmakers, the illustrators, the newsmen, they began to describe and portray the scenes of Lincoln's deathbed. Now, the room where Lincoln died is small, maybe 9.5 by 17 feet. There were a handful of people in there when he died, but by the time the printmakers were done with it, some of them had as many as 50 people in the room with the president, and some people who were never there. It was a moment of national myth being born. One person, though, who wasn't there in the room with him when he died was his wife, Mary. And it's an important moment now to step back and think about the Lincoln family and their bond. Mary Lincoln was there all night long, back and forth between the bedroom and the parlor, but she had been overcome by grief just before he died and was out in the parlor when he expired. She had known him for over 25 years by the time of his death in April of 1865. They had raised 4 boys together. They had a sometimes stormy relationship, but she knew him better than anybody. She was never again the same after the death of her husband. For the rest of her life in public, she never wore anything but mourning clothes, and she was in grief for years. About 10 years after the assassination, she had something like a breakdown, and her only surviving son at that point, Robert Todd Lincoln, he committed her against her will into a mental asylum for a period of a few months. It was an embarrassing and terrible moment in the family history. She was released, lived with her sister, and then traveled abroad, had a quiet end to her life. But the grief and the trauma of their family existence was hard to behold. Of course, though, it's symbolic of the larger tragedies that befell so many families in a war that killed so many people and affected and created so many widows and orphans.